Welcome to our Old Testament survey class. This is class number 2, where we will be covering Joshua through 2 Kings. In the class, in person, we'll be talking a little bit about the homework and about if you picked up anything from your reading in Henry Haley. There was a brief article about Megiddo. Here's some more pictures of the stairs that go down into the well at Megiddo. And one picture that's from the top of the hill of Megiddo, looking out into the valley of Jezreel, which stretches from the east and to the west in northern Israel, which happens to also, this is also where Armageddon will take place. Okay, let's get in. I want to talk a little bit about, we're going to be working on a timeline in the Old Testament. And for the class, I'm going to be handing out just an initial sketch of a timeline, which we will then be, over the next couple weeks, we will be adding where the books of the Old Testament were written, where the prophets wrote in conjunction with the timeline. I'm not going to take time today to point some of these things out, but this is just going to be a starting place. Okay, so, and if you want to add something to the top of your timeline, you might want to consider putting creation around 4000 BC and the flood of Noah around 2350 BC if you want. Those dates were made famous by Bishop Ussher, who published them in the 17th century based on chronologies in the Bible. And but for the sake, I'm going to start, for our sake, I'm going to start with the birth of Abraham. So enough with the timeline. We're going to be developing this over the next month or two. So let's talk about our first book, which is Joshua. And the author of the book of Joshua is, we think, Joshua. Joshua had been Moses' servant for the previous 40 years. And Joshua often served as a general to lead the armies of Israel against their various enemies when they were wandering. Like when they fought against the Amalekites. Remember the story where Moses had to have his hands held up. And as long as his hands were held up, then Joshua would have victory. Well, that kind of plays into the background with who Joshua is. He's not only a servant, but he's a fighting man. When was the book written? I'm going to put it around 1400 BC. I kind of regret having rounded last week's books to the date of 1400 BC. I wish I'd been a little more specific and put down 1440 BC, because this is written perhaps 40 to 60 years after the Pentateuch, which is the first 5 books of the Bible. Why is the book written? It's about conquering Canaan, the promised land. Deuteronomy ends with the death of Moses, and this takes up where that left off. The book of Joshua is Joshua's record of the nation of Israel conquering the promised land of Israel. The beginning of the book tells us of Joshua's call by God to lead Israel, and then Israel miraculously crossing the Jordan into the promised land. And we will see the various battles begin. The first battle will be at Jericho. And then there will be battles at Ai and Gibeon. Gibeon is where the sun will stand still for 24 hours while Israel fights. Through chapter 10, Israel conquers the entire southern area of Canaan. In chapter 11, we will have the northern kingdoms joining together to fight Israel, and Israel will defeat them all. And one of the kings that's one of the chief cities of the northern area is the city of Hatzor, which we're told that Joshua burnt to the ground. And the archaeologists or the scientists, the scholars used to say, well, there's no record of some of these cities being burnt. Well, today you can visit Hatzor, and they have dug it up, and the archaeologists have uncovered the layers of the city showing that it was burnt. And like Megiddo, there's also a deep well you can walk down into. In 1887, a file of ancient diplomatic correspondence was discovered in Egypt at the ancient city of Akhetaton, or Tel Amarna. These are the Tel Amarna tablets. These letters were written on clay tablets and give us the Canaanite account of Joshua's conquest, as the Canaanite kings were writing to the Pharaoh for help, and they called these strange invaders the Habiru. Sounds like Hebrew, doesn't it? The Hebrews. Let me summarize the rest of the book by saying that after conquering the land, then the rest of the book is primarily about how they divided up the land between the 12 tribes of Israel. Each tribe will get their own portion. Now, let me just give you a word about the 12 tribes. I get questions a lot about the 12 tribes. If you're going to find that in the Bible that depending on where you are reading, the list of 12 tribes may vary. Don't panic. First, there's always 12. There's always 12 tribes. Secondly, when Jacob blessed his son Joseph at the end of Jacob's life, this is the end of Genesis, he made Joseph's 2 sons equal to the rest of their uncles. In other words, he gave Joseph a double portion. And so you will often see the tribes of Manasseh and Ephraim, which are the sons of Joseph, as separate tribes, and they kind of take the place of Joseph, so that there's one extra tribe. But isn't that 13 tribes? Well, when you see Ephraim and Manasseh, often you won't see the tribe of Levi as one of those 12 tribes. It's kind of dropped from the list. Levi will be unique because God is their portion. This is the priestly tribe. They were spread throughout the nation as an opportunity to be there among the nation and remind them, teach them about God. Now, is there anything messianic in Joshua? I kind of think that Joshua himself is a picture of Jesus. I mean, his name, Yeshua, is actually the same as Jesus' name. Yeshua, Yah is short for Yahweh, and Shua means salvation. Yahweh is salvation. That's Jesus' name. Many have suggested that the conquest of Canaan is also a picture in some aspects of when Jesus comes back the second time to conquer this planet. Then there's this. In Joshua 5:13, here's another something that might be under the category of messianic. Before they start conquering, it says, verse 5, Joshua 5:13, now it came about when Joshua was by Jericho, he raised his eyes and looked, and behold, a man was standing opposite him with his sword drawn in his hand. And Joshua went to him and said, are you for us or for our enemies? And verse 14, it says, he said, this person said, no. It's not the answer you wanted. No. Rather, I have come now as captain of the army of Yahweh, of the Lord. What has my Lord to say to his servant? At verse 15, and the captain of the Lord's army said to Joshua, remove your sandals from your feet, for the place where you are standing is holy. And Joshua did so. Interesting figure. He's called the captain of the Lord's army. Could this be Jesus? I think it might be. Perhaps it might be. A significant verse in the book of Joshua. There's tons of them. God says, we'll say this to Joshua after the death of Moses, right at the beginning of the book. God's trying to encourage Joshua to be strong and courageous. Joshua 1:8 says, this book of the law shall not depart from your mouth, but you shall meditate on it day and night, so that you may be careful to do according to all that is written in it. For then you will make your way prosperous, and then you will have success. That sounds like a great verse to memorize, doesn't it? That might be one of the ones, that might be the one that you choose to memorize for your final, the end of class. Okay, let's go on to the book of Judges. The author, let me go back. The author, I'm going to say unknown. Not sure who wrote the book. When we're going to put it around 1000 BC, near to when the first king of Israel is raised up. We kind of get the evidence for that in the book itself when it talks about things. Why is the book of Judges written? Because it speaks about the need for a king. We are told that the people of Israel served Yahweh all the days of Joshua and all the days of the first leaders who followed Joshua. But after the death of that next generation, things began to change. The title Judges refers to those whom God would raise up every time the nation got into trouble. There is this cycle of backsliding that you see throughout the book of Judges over and over again. The people will fall away from God. Then there's an enemy that God allows to rise up to oppress the nation. And the people cry out to God. Then God will raise up a leader or a judge. He raises up a judge to deliver them. And then we could say rinse and repeat. This goes over and over through the book of Judges. You will read in the book of Judges about some of these judges named Ehud. That's kind of a sixth story at the beginning of Judges. Deborah, she's a woman. She will run the nation. Gideon, Jephthah, that's a pretty sad story. And Samson, you're probably very familiar with the story of Samson. The book of Judges is a very messy book, very messy. You're going to see prostitution, murder, child sacrifice, and lying. And that's just with the good guys. The book is not intended to give you examples to follow, but to point out the overriding theme. And I'm going to point this out as our significant verse in Judges 17:6. You will see this several times in the book. In those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. So keep this verse in mind as you read the book and you want to throw up. This is showing us just how low people will go, even good people. You know, let me just stop and say this. We sometimes think of a king over Israel as a bad thing because in the book of Samuel, God says, well, they rejected me from being their king. But in the book of Deuteronomy, there is provision for a king. What do we do when we have a king? And so there was a plan that at some point there will be a king. And this book, the book of Judges, shows us how bad the nation would get without a king. Now, is there anything messianic in this book? I believe Jesus himself shows up several times in this messy book of Judges. If it is true that Jesus has always existed since eternity past, then shouldn't he be around somewhere in the Old Testament from time to time before he takes on human flesh in Matthew 1? There's an individual that I could have pointed out to you in the book of Genesis, but I thought I'd save it here for the book of Judges. He actually appears 54 times in the Old Testament. And it's only the Old Testament. Pay attention, this is only the Old Testament. There is an exact, specific phrase in Hebrew, and it's Malach Adonai. That translates to the angel of the Lord, or you might say, now that you've learned this, you see it's all caps, the angel of Yahweh. It's not an angel, but the angel. The phrase is not an angel of God, but the phrase is about the angel of Yahweh. In the book of Judges alone, this Hebrew phrase is used 15 times. He will start in the book of Judges in chapter 2. I'll let you look for it. But I think one of the more significant passages is when this individual, it seems to be the same individual throughout the Old Testament, he will appear to Gideon. In Judges 6:12, it says this, "And the angel of Yahweh appeared to him and said to him, Yahweh is with you, or the Lord is with you, valiant warrior." Now, again, if you will track this phrase, I'm not going to do all your homework for you, but you're going to find that there's more than one place where this individual is actually then identified as Yahweh. We would say this is Jesus. We might call this what I think the term is a theophany. This is an appearance of God in a human-ish kind of form. Now, it's at this point that we kind of have some problems. We tend to think of the word angel as one of that and I hesitate to use the word race, but as a race of creatures, the guys with large wings, maybe even a sword or two, or else maybe we think of it as one of those cute little cherubs, shooting arrows at Valentine's Day. But the word angel in both Hebrew and in the New Testament, in the word Greek, in Hebrew it's malach, and in the Greek it's angelos. It kind of sounds like angel. What should we get our word from it? It simply means messenger in its basic form. It might indeed refer to one of God's special messengers, one of these created beings like the angel Gabriel. It could even be a human messenger. John the Baptist was described by Jesus as his messenger, and Jesus used the Greek word there, angelos, which we often translate as angel. You can read about that in Matthew 11:10. But quick little note to self, this exact Hebrew phrase does not show up in the New Testament. Malach Adonai. This is an Old Testament phenomena, which makes sense, doesn't it? Because in Matthew chapter 1, Jesus takes on human flesh. He's no longer the messenger of Yahweh. He is God in human flesh. Gabriel will show up in the first couple of chapters of Matthew, and he's called an angel of the Lord. But the language is a little bit different, and again, that's in Greek, not in Hebrew. This is an Old Testament phrase. Now, I want to stop here and give you the answers to the quiz. So if you're taking notes and you're going to take the quiz, and if you're missing class and you're going to email me the answers, I'm going to give you the answers right here. So the first question, I'm going to give you 2 questions this week. Who was the angel of the Lord? The angel of the Lord is it Gabriel? Is it Michael? Or is it Jesus? And what do you think it is? Well, it's Jesus. The answer is the angel of the Lord is Jesus. The second question is, where does the angel of the Lord appear? And this is why I think it's kind of important that you get this. Sorry that kind of goes over my face in the video. Where does the angel of the Lord appear? Is it the Old Testament, the New Testament, or both Old and New Testaments? And the correct answer, as I've just told you, is that this is only the Old Testament. Only a phenomena in the Old Testament. Okay, there's your quiz. Okay. Let's go on to the book of Ruth. Now, I'm sorry. This is Ruth. I got pictures of her. Well, she's her first grandchild, and she's the cutest little 6-year-old that you would ever meet. But sadly, that is not who our next book is about. And if you think I'm going to try to figure out how to squeeze in Micah and Jeremiah and Hezekiah, my other grandkids, you bet you're right. I'm going to squeeze in pictures of them somewhere. Anyway, Ruth. The author of Ruth, we're going to say, is unknown. We're going to put it roughly around 1000 BC, which is around the time of the end of the Judges. That's the end of the book of Judges. David is mentioned by name at the end, so it's possible that it was written after he became king. Why is the book of Ruth written? It's because this is King David's lineage. You're going to see at the end of the book, there is a genealogy and it ends with King David. This story will take place at the end of the period of the Judges. A family from Bethlehem will travel to Moab to escape a famine. And there, the 2 sons in this family are married to 2 Moabite women. But the famine even hits Moab, and the dad and the 2 sons die in the famine. And all that's left is the mom and her 2 daughters-in-law. One of the daughters-in-law will end up coming with her back to Bethlehem. And the daughter-in-law that stayed with the mother named Naomi, the daughter-in-law that stays is named Ruth. Ruth. That's the rough story. Now, is there anything messianic in the book of Ruth? It's only 4 chapters. It's an easy read. You should read it sometime if you haven't. Is there anything messianic? Yes, I want to talk about a principle we call the kinsman redeemer. This is in my notes somewhere, but the Hebrew word is goel, and we see this several places in the book of Ruth. It's in Ruth 2, verse 20. Second half of the verse says, Naomi says to Ruth, "The man is our relative. He is one of our redeemers," and that's that word goel in the Hebrew. The book of Ruth is centered around the Jewish law that we're going to call the kinsman redeemer. And there are actually two parts of the law that you're going to see played out in the book of Ruth. If a relative of yours becomes so poor that they have to sell their family farm, well, after a period of years, someone who is related to that person can become the redeemer, or someone who buys back the property so that the property will stay within the family. That's always God's goal, is that the property would stay with each family. This is spelled out in Leviticus 25. We're not going to look there. That can be extra credit homework. But there's a second law that plays out in the book of Ruth. If a male relative marries, but he dies before there's any children, then there's an obligation to the next living male relative to take the widow, marry her, and have children in the name of the dead husband. Now, this is technically called the Levirate law, Levirite. The Levirate law, you can read about it in Deuteronomy 25, when Jesus is challenged by the Sadducees. They will bring this up, who's in the resurrection, whose wife is she? That's all part of the Levirate law. When Ruth comes back to Bethlehem with Naomi, there's this backstory of trying to find a husband for Ruth, because she's now a widow. She doesn't have any kids. And so will they find a redeemer to marry Ruth and to maybe even buy back the farm? So that's kind of what's between the lines here, written in here. She will just coincidentally run into a man named Boaz, who qualifies to be a goel, a kinsman redeemer. And they're going to end up getting married. And Boaz will redeem the family property. There's even some legal issues that are played out that are performed in front of the city elders, which is a fascinating thing to study all on its own. And by the way, who's Boaz? He is the son of the Canaanite Rahab. Remember Rahab the harlot, city of Jericho? Boaz is her son. And so in David's lineage, because this is what, great-great-great-great-grandparents, something like that. In David's lineage, there is both a Canaanite and a Moabite. That's amazing. That shouldn't be right. This is God's grace. This is God's grace. Now, messianic. See, Jesus is our kinsman redeemer. And if you read Revelations chapter 4 through 5, you see a situation that you can almost lay the book of Ruth on top of it, and you see the parallel situation being played out in heaven with a scroll, which we would call the title deed of the earth, and an angel cries out, "Who is worthy to open the scroll?" In other words, who is a near kinsman to redeem the earth? Jesus is that redeemer. And it's interesting in Revelation 4 and 5, the whole legal issues of this scroll are played out before the elders in heaven, just like the book of Ruth. It's a wonderful thing. Now, significant verse. Some of you are familiar with this. Earlier in the story, the very first chapter, Naomi is pleading for her two daughter-in-laws. So just leave me alone. I'm not going to be able to have kids to raise up husbands for you. So just you guys, you are free from your obligation. You can stay in Moab. Well, in Ruth 1:16, we have this beautiful statement here by Ruth. Ruth says, "Do not plead with me to leave you or to go back from following you. For where you go, I will go, and where you sleep, I will sleep. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord, or may Yahweh, do so to me, and worse, if anything but death separates me from you." What a beautiful example of commitment. Many people use this, maybe you did this, use this in their marriage ceremony. Where you go, I will go. Where you sleep, I will sleep. Beautiful passage. Okay, let's move on to 1 Samuel. Author, sorry, unknown. We're going to see a lot of that in these books today. Author is unknown. And like the book of Ruth, so it's like the book of Ruth, we don't know who the author is, but there are some clues as to where the content comes from. In the scriptures, we see other historical sources that were known at this time. In 1 Chronicles 29:29, it mentions the Chronicles of Samuel the seer, the Chronicles of Nathan the prophet, and the Chronicles of Gad the seer. We don't know what those are. We don't have records of those separate documents. In 2 Samuel 1:18, it mentions the book of Yasher, or Jasher, you might pronounce it. So whoever wrote it, it seems like they were able to draw from existing records. And under David's administration, we do have this in 2 Samuel chapter 8. We see various men listed with their duties. And if you notice, it mentions in verse 16, there's somebody, Jehoshaphat, the son of Ahilud, who was a secretary. And in verse 17, there was Sariah, who was a scribe. I think it's possible that one or both of these guys might have been involved in keeping a record of the things in the kingdom, the history. When was it written? I'm going to put it around 930 BC. It would seem that it was written after the death of Solomon. Now, let me say something about these next four books. In its earliest form, the Hebrew Bible considered the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel as a single book. They also considered 1st and 2nd Kings as a single book. Later on, it's about 200 BC, the Alexandrian Jews, when they would translate the Old Testament into Greek, they even combined 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings into one giant single super book that they called Kingdoms. Because, see, these books do form a continuous history of the nation of Israel. Now, eventually, both Christians and Jews will separate these into the four books that we have today, 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings. Now, why 1st Samuel? Because it's the establishment of the kingdom. That's the aim of 1st Samuel. The book gets its name from the prophet Samuel, who plays a significant role through most of the book. Samuel is considered the last of the judges. He was a prophet who delivered the nation from the Philistines for a period of time. And so the book of 1 Samuel will cover his life and ministry, but then Samuel is the one who will anoint Saul to be the first king. And so this book of 1 Samuel will cover the kingdom of King Saul as well. So it covers these two guys' life story. Is there anything messianic? Well, I think there's a hint of something. There's all kinds of stuff in the Bible. 1 Samuel 13:14 says, "But now your kingdom shall not endure." This is Samuel speaking to Saul. "The Lord has sought for himself a man after his own heart, and the Lord has appointed him ruler over his people, because you have not kept what the Lord commanded you." So even though this is initially fulfilled in David, David himself is a picture of Christ. And in fact, about Jesus, Jesus himself said, "He who sent me is with me. He has not left me alone." Look at this. "For I always do the things that are pleasing to him." That's a man after God's own heart. Now, a significant verse. It's hard to pick one. God had a special mission for King Saul. He was supposed to be the one who would completely wipe out the evil Amalekites. take all that and wipe out also everything that they possessed. Now Saul only partially did what he was asked. He didn't kill the king, and he didn't kill the best of the animals. And so when Samuel shows up to see what Saul has done, he can hear the Amalekite sheep bleating in the background, and he's thinking, what's this sheep doing? Saul replies to Samuel that he was planning on sacrificing the best of these animals to the Lord, to Yahweh. And here's the verse. You've probably heard this. 1 Samuel 15:22. And Samuel said, "Does the Lord have as much delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Lord? Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to pay attention is better than the fat of rams." This was the final straw for God with Saul. And at this point, God will say, this is it. The kingdom's going to be taken from you and given to another, which, again, this is going to take a little time for that to happen. We have that old saying, it's better to ask for forgiveness than to ask for permission. Well, not when it comes to the things of God. It's really better to do what God asks you to do rather than disobey and think, well, I can just go ask for forgiveness. Look, to obey is better than sacrifice. Okay, let's go on to 2 Samuel. The author, unknown. It's kind of like for Samuel. When, again, I'm going to say around 930 BC. Why? Well, this is the kingdom of David, 2 Samuel. The book starts with David becoming king at Saul's death, and it will cover the entire reign of David's rule, the entire time. Messianic, well, there is something that says super duper here in the book of 2 Samuel. In 2 Samuel 7, verse 12, this is a big one. This is God speaking through the prophet to David, because David wanted to build a house for God, and God said, no, I think I'm going to build you a house. And in 2 Samuel 7:12, it says, when your days are finished and you lie down with your fathers, I will raise up your descendant after you, who will come from you, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. Now, God promises David he's going to have a special son whose kingdom lasts forever. Now, you might say, well, isn't that Solomon? Well, how long did Solomon's kingdom last? Well, it only lasted 40 years. This is actually talking about Jesus. This is the Messiah. The Messiah is always referred to as the son of David. That's why there's a genealogy in the New Testament of Jesus, to show that he was a descendant of David. This is the key messianic passage in the Old Testament, among others. I shouldn't say the key, whatever. Significant verse. During David's first 7 years, he will rule only the tribe of Judah. Eventually, all the tribes will unite to make David their king. That's for 33 years. David did not have it easy as a king. His people, he often had people challenge his leadership. He was always at war. Even 2 of his sons tried to toss Dad off his throne. We love that David is called a man after God's own heart. And we love that the Messiah would come from David. But let me just say this. David was a deeply flawed human. There's no covering this up. In 2 Samuel chapter 11, verse 2, we read this. Now at evening time, David got up from his bed and walked around on the roof of the king's house. And from the roof he saw a woman bathing, and the woman was very beautiful in appearance. Well, you know what's going to happen. You've heard the story. I've preached it many times. He's going to sleep with Bathsheba, another man's wife. He's going to have that man put to death. He's going to lie about everything. He's going to take her as his wife. God's going to rebuke him big time. But the issue is this. Pay attention. God loved and God used a man with deep faults. And God wants to use you, even with your faults. When Jesus was being tried and crucified. Peter was going through the worst time of his life. He had publicly denied Jesus 3 times. Jesus had already warned him about it. And Jesus saw and heard him do it. But was God finished with Peter? No. Jesus tracks down Peter after the resurrection up in Galilee, and he asks him 3 times, Peter, do you love me? And in John chapter 21, verse 17, he said to him the 3rd time, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Peter was hurt because he said to him the 3rd time, do you love me? And he said to him, Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you. And Jesus said to him, tend my sheep. Jesus wasn't trying to rub Peter's failure in his face. He was reminding Peter that because Peter really loves Jesus, even if it's flawed, he needed to get back to do what Jesus called him to do. He needed to feed God's sheep. Look, God would prefer that we don't sin. He would prefer that we learn to get some of these repetitive sins under control. But when we sin, he isn't done with you. There is forgiveness. You repent, you ask, and God will forgive. There is restoration. You turn around and serve Jesus. Okay, 1 Kings. The author. Now remember, initially 1st and 2nd Kings was a single book, so our author is unknown. Now, I've got something to throw out as a tidbit. The Talmud, which is a Jewish commentary on the Old Testament, the Talmud asserts that Jeremiah was the author, but I'm not going to put all my eggs in that basket. The author of 1st and 2nd Kings does have other sources that he pulls from, kind of like in the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel. There's a book called the Acts of Solomon. There's a book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Judah. This is in my notes. There's a book of the Kings of Israel, and there's a large portion that's borrowed from the book of Isaiah, 3 chapters, which is when the Assyrians came against Hezekiah. Now, when was this written? I'm going to put it around 580 BC. It is written after the Babylonians wipe out Jerusalem. And why was 1 Kings written? Because this is about the split of the kingdom. Solomon will reign for 40 years, and this is the beginning of this book. But after that, there is a civil war. And from that point on, there will always be 2 separate kingdoms. And we need to learn to know these kingdoms by their names. I'm going to try to remind you when we get to the prophets, because it's important that you get this. When we get to the prophets, you need to be aware of where the prophets are in the timeline. And if they write after the split of the kingdom, and they all do, you need to know that the names of the nation has changed. It doesn't mean that there weren't prophets before the kingdom split. There were prophets, but they just didn't write any books like Elijah and Elisha. The northern kingdom after the split will be primarily known as Israel, because it will have the 10 tribes out of the 12. It will get the name Israel. It will also be called Samaria, which is the capital city. It will also be called Ephraim, which was the chief tribe of these 10 tribes of the northern kingdom. The southern kingdom will primarily be known as Judah. That's most of the time it will be known as Judah. Sometimes it's known as Jerusalem, which is the capital city. So it's good to kind of get these names under your belt so that when you get into the prophets, major prophets, Isaiah, Ezekiel, Jeremiah, and when you get into the minor prophets like Daniel and Hosea and all this, you need to understand that when you see the word Israel, it's usually talking about the northern kingdom, and when it's talking about Judah, it's talking about the southern kingdom. So, Halley's, remember your book, Halley's? It has some excellent charts that lay side by side the various kings of the 2 kingdoms. It's in 1 Kings that you will meet the amazing prophet Elijah. How about a significant verse? I wasn't quite sure where to go with this, but the man who split the kingdom was named Jeroboam. he was responding to the harshness of Solomon's son Rehoboam, and God was actually kind of involved in this split, yet Jeroboam took things too far. God promised Jeroboam that if he would follow God, God would establish his kingdom. But Jeroboam became afraid that, part of Jewish culture that was laid out in the law was that 3 times a year, all Jews from the entire nation were to converge on the place that God would set up where his name would be, Jerusalem. And the Jews from everywhere were supposed to converge on Jerusalem to celebrate, to worship God. And Jeroboam became afraid that if everybody goes back on the feast to Jerusalem, they're going to leave me and become loyal to the southern kingdom. And so it says, 1 Kings 12:28, so the king consulted, and he made 2 golden calves. Where did he get that from? I don't know. And he said to the people, it is too much for you to go to Jerusalem. It's just too far. Behold your gods, Israel, that brought you up from the land of Egypt. And he set up one in Bethel, and the other he put in Dan. Now, this is a turning point in the history of the northern kingdom of Israel. This will eventually lead to the downfall of the northern kingdom, because through all their ups and downs, and they'll have some ups, they never stopped worshiping the calves that Jeroboam set up in Bethel and Dan. Bethel was in the southern portion of the northern kingdom, so it was kind of on the border with Judah. Dan was at the northern border, and nowadays we think of it on the border with Syria. So, significant verse, the calves. Messianic, well, I think in a way Solomon is a type of Christ. Of course, he was also pretty flawed. Solomon was the son of David. He was the wisest person ever, and he would build God's temple. That sounds a lot like Jesus. When the Queen of Sheba met Solomon, it says in 1 Kings 10:4, when the Queen of Sheba saw all the wisdom of Solomon and the house that he had built, and the food of his table, the seating of his servants, the service of his waiters and their attire, his cupbearers and his burnt offerings, which he offered at the house of the Lord, she was breathless. Well, imagine what will happen when we meet Jesus face to face. I imagine we too will be just a bit breathless. 2 Kings. Author, same as 1 Kings, which is unknown. When, or maybe Jeroboam. When? Same time as 1 Kings. I have to look that up. About 580 BC, was it? Why is 2 Kings written? This is really to record the fall of the northern and the southern kingdoms. The northern kingdom will fall to the Assyrians in 722 BC. That's in chapter 17. And the southern kingdom will fall to Babylon in 586 BC. That's at the end of the book. So it records the fall of the kingdoms. Messianic. I'm going to say Elisha is a type of Jesus as well. He performed many miracles, including healing a leper, feeding a large group of people with just a little bit of food, and he raised the dead. 2 Kings chapter 4, it says, Elisha entered the house. When he entered the house, behold, the boy was dead, laid on his bed. So he entered and shut the door behind them, and he prayed to the Lord. Then he got up on the bed and lay on the child and put his mouth on his mouth, his eyes on his eyes, his hands on his hands, and he bent down on him, and the flesh of the child became warm. Then he returned and walked in the house back and forth once, and then went up and bent down on him, and the boy sneezed 7 times. Then the boy opened his eyes. Elisha, he raised the dead. I think he's a type of Christ. Significant verse. It's in 2 Kings 17 that we see the end of the northern kingdom of Israel, and it will be conquered by the Assyrians and carried off into exile. Why did that happen? Well, 2 Kings 17:22 says, and the sons of Israel walked in all the sins of Jeroboam which he committed. They did not desist from them until the Lord removed Israel from his sight, just as he had spoken through all his servants the prophets. So Israel went into exile from their own land to Assyria until this day. So, no, there's a lot of things they did to provoke God. But the worst was the one that started at the beginning of the split. This is always called the sins of Jeroboam. These are the 2 golden calves. And they never changed. They never repented from that sin. Now, just in case you think God's awfully mean for doing this, keep in mind, this is about 200 years that God puts up with them. I think we have an example of how patient God is. Okay, so if we are in class, and let's pretend that we are, here's where the quiz is. Okay, if you are watching this online and you're trying to catch up, write down your answers and email me, because you've been getting emails from me. So the first question is, who was the angel of Yahweh, the angel of the Lord? Was it A, Gabriel? Was it B, Michael? Was it C, Jesus? And question number 2, I'm sorry, I guess it'll get most of it. Where does the angel of Yahweh appear? And I mean which books, where in the Bible? Is it A, in the Old Testament? Is it B, in the New Testament? Or maybe it's C, both Old and New Testament. So where does the angel of Yahweh appear? Now, I've already given you the answer, so hopefully this is not very hard for you. Okay, homework for this week. You want to be reading some more in your Haley's Bible Handbook. And you're going to need to look for the Babylonian exile and the return from exile. That begins a section. And you want to read through that section all the way through the book of Esther. Now, it's not all that long. In my deluxe version, it's 17 pages. And I'm going to ask you, like I'm going to ask the class this morning or tomorrow morning, I want to hear from some of you about what you might have learned in your reading. Did you learn something new? Okay, so next week we'll be covering 1 Chronicles through the book of Esther, and we're going to then finish what we call the historical books, and we will continue to work on our timeline. So with that, I pray that God would bless you and keep you. I pray that he'd make his face shine on you and be gracious to you. I pray that he'd lift up his countenance on you and give you his peace.